Bandicoot. If Cortex isn't beaten, he'll reign absolute. Crash! Crash Bandicoot! Play our game and tell your friends so we'll make lots of loot.
On May 11, 1995, the first congregation of video game developers, publishers, and hardware accessory manufacturers came together at the Los Angeles Convention Center for 3 days. They called it the Electronics Entertainment Expo, or simply E3. It was born out of the Chicago Consumer Electronics Show, where video game publishers were usually relegated to a basement. This time they had the main floor. The home console was about to become the fastest growing industry in the world. Even Sony had something new.
From the world's best game developers, your man, first-person gaming from the company that's always first in entertainment technology, Sony PlayStation, into the game.
Steve Race from Sony gave a brief speech on the price.
$299.
Initial speculation put the price over the Sega Saturn, which was announced earlier at E3 for $399. Suffice to say, it went over well, with 50 games being announced for the PlayStation 1. But next year, Sony was ready to dominate the market. They came back to E3 1996 with a far more aggressive approach.
At Sony, our philosophy on price changes is really very simple. As we said before, either go big or go home. So effective immediately, the Sony PlayStation will now be available for sale at retail for $199.
First, they came with a new price drop. Next, they came with a few properties they had been investing in. One from Naughty Dog. They were a video game developer that came about in 1984 and had produced about 6 games prior to the 1996 E3. Notably, it was Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin, 2 lifelong friends who had developed Keith the Thief and Rings of Power. But it wasn't until they produced Way of the Warrior, a 3D animated fighting game, that they had gained traction. It wasn't a huge success, but it was enough for the game's publisher, Universal Interactive, to renew Naughty Dog for 3 more games.
By 1994, 24-year-olds Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin have gone from 2 kids hacking in their basement to a lucrative deal with Universal, and one of their most famous games is born on a road trip.
On our way across country from Boston to Los Angeles, I think it was Iowa, that we decided that we wanted to make a character action game. And by the time we left Iowa, we had decided that we wanted to do it in fully 3D.
The new 3D rendered game focused on platform levels with good detail and revolutionary camera angle the guys referred to as Sonic's ass game, due to the view from behind the character. Charles Zembalus and Joe Pearson met with Andy and Jason weekly as they ironed out a game. Cycling through names, they went through Willy the Wombat initially, but they gravitated towards names like Smash or Bash, but after 2 years of development, his name was Crash Bandicoot, and he was unveiled at E3 in May of 1996. Crash was huge at the convention. Sony even booted one of its original games in order to feature Crash Bandicoot more. Massive screens all over displayed his name. However, it wasn't the only big thing to hit the expo that year. Nintendo had stalled the year prior in order to work out the kinks in its newest system. After years of developing a new console, Nintendo finally had worked out a 64-bit central processing unit, which they were calling the Nintendo 64. And with it at E3, they launched their star game, Super Mario 64. And while Jason and Andy at Naughty Dog were concerned, Miyamoto at Nintendo also had his own interest in Crash Bandicoot. And why wouldn't he? It was a sensation amongst the community. E3 loved and embraced Crash as something new and truly groundbreaking. It had new school style and old school mechanics with a fun original character. The story begins with Dr. Neo Cortex and his assistant Dr. Nitrous Brio as they mutate the animals living on the Wumpa Islands. Dr. Cortex uses his vortex to try and control Crash, a bandicoot who he intends to be the leader of his army of animal soldiers. The untested vortex rejects Crash, allowing him to escape, but after Crash leaps out a window and falls to the ocean below, Cortex prepares a female bandicoot named Tawna for experimentation. Crash now must traverse the island to try and save her.
Crash Bandicoot. Definition: heroic, hyperactive, and hairy. Join Crash as he whirls his way through the gruesome gauntlet of Bandicoot hating, Bandicoot smashing, Bandicoot eating Bandicoot.
Crash Bandicoot was released to the public in September of 1996, and just as you might have predicted, it was a huge success.
Nintendo has Mario. Sega has Sonic. We're going to make the mascot for Sony. Now, Sony never needed, never wanted, and never created a mascot for the PlayStation, but it was the defining character action game for the PlayStation.
It was a fan favorite, garnering some high praise from game critics, which all helped in feeding its new marketing.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you here.
Check it out. What do you think about that? We got real-time, 3D, lush organic environments. How's that make you feel, buddy?
Feel a little like your days are numbered?
I'm gonna have to ask you to leave.
You're hurting my elbow.
Is that Italian?
No, Bandicoot is an Australian name.
Crash was everywhere. There were ads in comics. He was even a NASCAR with a long list of commercials. The stats were coming in, a sequel was in the works, and from here on it seemed like Crash owned E3. He was Sony and PlayStation's Golden Bandicoot. He was even a spokesperson for Pizza Hut when it was first introducing cheese stuffed crust. He was huge.
Would you like to work here?
I'm not housebroken.
But no one at Naughty Dog, not even Crash, was ready for what was next, adapting the game for a new audience.
For the Japanese release, some changes are in order. So back to the drawing board it is to give Crash a little makeover.
So we took a break for 15 minutes, and I went to one of our artists, Charlotte France, and I said, Charlotte, close his mouth. Get him a smile, but get rid of all teeth. And Charlotte worked frantically for 15 minutes, got rid of it. We printed out that image. I walked in, and they said, that's Crash Bandicoot. They worked their entire marketing plan around creating an image for Japan that worked.
With tweaks to Crash's appearance and place, in December 1996, Crash is released in Japan. Crash Bandicoot becomes the first US title to sell over 1 million units, and Crash Mania hits Japan, even inspiring a dance.
The dance became so popular that later a VHS of Crash teaching you how to do the dance was released and became big all across Japan. Japanese audiences connected with Crash bigger than anyone would have expected. The marketing campaign became a bonanza, and the costumed character was an icon. So after the game made a splash in Japan, it was time for Crash to come home. He came to the Naughty Dog offices and traveled all around the country. By air, land, and sea, Crash went everywhere. He even ran into his American counterpart. Where else but at Universal Studios. This was probably only a couple years after his initial release that he was seen in the parks. Universal made it clear that they had every intention of using their newly found IP. Crash was welcomed into the previously existing characters like Woody Woodpecker and Fievel. Universal's major concern was that they needed more cartoon characters, so Crash was a good addition to both Universal Studios Florida and Universal Hollywood.
Crash Bandicoot the sequel is released in 1997, and by January 98, sales of both Crash 1 and 2 reached 5 million units worldwide. Crash Warp sells over 1 million units following its 1998 debut. The Bandicoot becomes a legend, and in 1999, Crash resurfaces on a kart racer.
Naughty Dog at this point had put out Crash, Crash 2, Crash Warped, and Crash Team Racing consecutively once a year.
The Crash franchise has generated more than $300 million. Not bad for a couple of kids from DC.
But with Sony and Universal both dealing with publishing the game, a problem arose.
The beginning of Universal's relationship with Naughty Dog was Universal is a powerhouse in Hollywood. That was the spirit with which we joined Universal.
Management began to change at Universal, and they ended up in this odd middleman position.
As we kept moving forward, Mark realized as well, that the best way to create games was to do the production at Naughty Dog and the publishing at Sony, and that Universal was not adding to the mix.
So we just kind of outgrew them.
Naughty Dog severs ties with Universal and Crash, the little guy that helped launch them.
Jason and Andy taking Naughty Dog to Sony and leaving Crash behind at Universal was a difficult decision. But they went on in 2001 to premiere their newest 3D platform action genre game called Jak and Daxter. It was a massive success and spawned several sequels, including its own racing game. Crash continued to appear at Universal Hollywood throughout the early 2000s, and around 2003 the parks were even visited by a friend of his from Universal Interactive, Spyro the Dragon. And while he was rarely seen around the park, Crash was still a fan favorite. By 2000, Universal Interactive had become Vivendi Universal, and still, they very much wanted to promote Crash by spawning a myriad of new games. These included a party-style fight and mini-game called Crash Bash in 2000, and while it performed well, the mechanics of the game had issues. Then in 2001, The Wrath of Cortex, a new Crash Bandicoot installment, came out and was available on GameCube, Xbox, and in addition to PlayStation. Crash was no longer Sony's. Universal owned him now, and they used him to make 2 Game Boy Advance games, a new racing game, more Game Boy games, a couple new platformers, another racing game, another party game, a few iPhone games. Crash was on a roll. Even if he was being just passed from developer to developer, Crash was still big. He was even a McDonald's toy in other countries around the world. Action figures were developed, in addition to different remote control cars, vehicles. He had a tape, a costume, and enough Crash merch to feed a growing demand. In Universal, he appeared in a disco show where Crash and other Universal characters danced to disco tracks and did the hand jive. This show appeared in different sections in Universal and was similar to the Character Jam show, which was hosted by Beetlejuice, and took place in Universal Studios Hollywood lower lot. By 2010, Crash Nitro Kart 2 was released on the iPhone, and the popularity had dwindled by early 2012. Crash was phased out of the parks and said goodbye from the video games, and now from his cosmological plane. But, like all legends, comebacks are all too inevitable. At E3 2016, Crash came back. A remastered Crash Bandicoot, which covered the first 3 games, was announced. It was called the Insane Trilogy. It was also announced that Crash would appear alongside Spyro in Skylanders, a Netflix show and toy cross-promotion blending video game.
What is your name, young man?
Crash Bandicoot. And I have no idea how I got here.
For now, it seems like he might be on his way back. But it's important to remember that Crash has lived many lives, and he couldn't have done it without the entire team at Naughty Dog keeping him together.